campus speech ended in a single, fatal discharge, and before the questions were answered, another shock arrived that swallowed the conversation whole. If you want first-hand updates on this developing story and others, hit subscribe and turn on the bell now. Charlie Kirk was shot at an event on the Utah Valley University campus on September 10, 2025. The scene was chaotic and immediate. People ducked for cover, phones recorded scattered frames, and emergency personnel rushed into a space that had minutes earlier been full of debate and applause. In the hours that followed, investigators secured what evidence they could, prosecutors announced charges, and the machinery of criminal justice began its work. For a brief period, the nation focused hard on the case, on questions of motive, means, and whether a lone attacker or a larger plot had caused the tragedy. But as the days passed, that focus thinned in ways that left family members and many observers unsatisfied. Important forensic tests were underway, witness statements were still being reconciled, and some footage remained unavailable to the public, sealed, or otherwise inaccessible. The public wanted a running accounting. What they received instead were periodic, technical updates that satisfied professional standards but did little to reassure a grieving community that every credible lead was being followed and every question being answered. Then, barely 3 weeks later, an unrelated act of violence in Michigan seized the nation's attention. On September 28, 2025, a gunman attacked a church, killing worshippers and damaging a sacred place of community life. The human horror of that event was immediate and visceral. Because it happened in a house of worship, because multiple victims were involved, and because the local authorities took a highly public approach to briefing the media and community, the Michigan attack became the dominant story almost overnight. Coverage shifted from one tragedy to the other with a speed that stunned many, and that speed exposed the structural problem at the heart of modern public discourse about violence. National attention is a scarce resource, and the news cycle is unforgiving. When two tragedies occur so close together, editors and producers must choose. Television newsrooms, online outlets, and social feeds naturally gravitate to the newest shock, the freshest images, the place where families and communities are still in immediate need of information. But that editorial rhythm has consequences. The Utah case, which demanded slow, methodical forensic work, ballistics matching, digital log retrieval, and careful witness interviewing, lost the continuous public spotlight it had briefly held. The result was a sense, among families and supporters, that a case that deserved sustained national scrutiny was being allowed to recede quietly while another tragedy took center stage. Families and advocates in the Utah case pressed for clarity. They wanted regular briefings that explained not raw investigative secrets, but process, what labs were being used, how long ballistics comparisons typically take, which custodians of footage had been identified and asked to preserve material. They also wanted assurances that nothing relevant had been overlooked or allowed to disappear under routine data retention policies. Those demands are reasonable. In complex investigations, the public cannot always be shown every piece of evidence, but it can be given a clear account of how long typical steps should take and why some information must remain confidential. Where investigators failed to provide that procedural transparency, silence created a vacuum. In that vacuum, rumor and partisan rhetoric found purchase. Social feeds filled with speculation, theories gained traction, and the families felt that, while professionals worked, the public conversation had moved on to the next tragedy without finishing the first. By contrast, the Michigan authorities leaned into visibility. Local and state officials provided near-daily briefings, shared details about evidence and victims when appropriate, and discussed avenues of motive and method in ways that respected both legal boundaries and the public's need for information. That consistent cadence of information produced two effects. It fed the national appetite for a live narrative, and it created a frame by which the Utah case was judged. People compared the two public responses and, almost invariably, concluded that the case with more regular, human-scale updates felt more accountable. That comparison is not simply about optics, it's about the civic contract. When authorities communicate often and clearly, the public is reassured that the investigation is active and transparent. When communication is limited, the public assumes either stalling or concealment, even when neither is true. Critics and some commentators argued that the media's pivot to Michigan benefited political or institutional interests connected to the Utah matter. Those accusations are serious and must be treated with caution. Coincidence is common in a big country where terrible things can and do happen at the same time. Editors respond to audience demand, and the scale and nature of the Michigan attack naturally drew intense coverage. Yet the perception that silence around the Kirk case had advantages for some actors did not arise in a vacuum. It was reinforced by the earlier pattern of rapid arrest and charging followed quickly by a drop in public-facing updates. Where there is a gap between detailed investigative work that is rightly confidential and the public's expectation of ongoing accountability, suspicion grows. The antidote to suspicion isn't always full disclosure of investigative secrets. Doing so can jeopardize evidence or legal strategy, but it is a steady, public accounting of process. Here's what we're testing, here's how long it typically takes, and here's when we expect to provide more complete findings. The timing of tragedies can also be weaponized, intentionally or not. News cycles have rhythms. Social media amplifies the immediate and cruelly forgets the earlier. Institutions that prefer less scrutiny, whether because of potential negligence, bureaucratic error, or political sensitivity, may not have engineered a distraction, but they can still exploit one if it appears. That is why advocates call for institutional safeguards, third-party audits of investigative procedures in high-profile cases, mandatory transparency checklists for public statements, and legally protected timelines for public disclosures where possible. Such safeguards would make it harder for legitimate investigative slowness to be perceived as secrecy and would limit the ability of any actor to benefit from the natural ebb and flow of media attention. Public frustration grows when accountability seems selective. People understand that not every detail can be broadcast. They do not accept silence about whether evidence is being preserved or whether standard protocols are being followed. They want two things at once: thorough investigations that protect the integrity of evidence, and a public trail of what is being done and why. The failure to provide both opens the door to cynicism. And cynicism has costs. It erodes confidence in law enforcement, it discourages cooperation from witnesses who fear their testimony will vanish into official opacity, and it allows political narratives to shape the discussion rather than the documented facts. From a practical standpoint, the contrast between the two cases offers lessons about how investigations can remain both rigorous and publicly accountable. First, agencies should adopt routine process briefings in major cases. Not every forensic detail, but a calendar of expected steps with estimated timelines and explanations of why certain details cannot be disclosed. Second, when possible, agencies should secure third-party validators, inspectors, auditors, or, when appropriate, retired experts with no stake in the case, to review evidence preservation steps and confirm they meet professional standards. Third, media organizations should commit to sustained follow-up coverage of major investigations, rather than only chasing the next biggest headline. This requires editorial investments and a commitment to public service beyond immediate clicks. Fourth, lawmakers and leaders should consider statutory frameworks that mandate certain transparency measures in cases of public interest while protecting investigatory integrity. There are also human dimensions that editorial metrics cannot capture. For the family of Charlie Kirk, every day that passes with few public updates is another day of uncertainty and emotional turmoil. For the Michigan victims' families, the daily briefings and human stories help them feel seen and supported in public grief. Both sets of families deserve dignity, attention, and most of all, truth. That truth will come from patient, careful work in labs and courts, but also from how transparently those processes are explained to the public. When institutions fail at that dual job, investigating thoroughly and explaining clearly, their legitimacy suffers. Some will ask whether it is realistic to expect equal coverage for every tragedy. The short answer is no. Attention cannot be equally divided, and human empathy often tracks with proximity, novelty, and scale. The fairer, more realistic expectation is that investigations be conducted with equal rigor, and that their processes be described with comparable transparency. Media organizations cannot investigate every lead, but they can provide context, Explain why a case's public updates slow down, name the specific types of tests that require time, and follow up when the formal milestones, ballistics reports, grand jury decisions, or major discovery filings are reached. Ultimately, justice demands more than headlines. It requires processes that are methodical, auditable, and accountable. It requires a professional judiciary that enforces discovery and disclosure obligations, law enforcement that documents and preserves evidence scrupulously, and a media ecosystem willing to hold institutions to account even when there is a fresher story to cover. When those systems function, even slow justice can feel like progress. When they falter, even quick arrests and sensational images become hollow. This is a calling to civic patience and civic insistence. Ask authorities for process, not gossip, not jumpy speculation, but a timeline of investigations and an accounting of what remains to be tested. Ask media outlets to keep a steady eye on major cases instead of pivoting away the moment a new shock arrives. Ask legislators to consider measures that promote transparency in high-profile probes without jeopardizing the work itself. And ask your community to hold both tragedies in memory, to demand that each family receives the same seriousness of inquiry and the same commitment to truth. 2 tragedies, 2 communities, and 1 urgent civic question. Will institutions give equal weight to both, or will one grief be prioritized while another is placed on a slow, invisible shelf? The answer matters for justice, for trust, and for a society that promises protection and accountability to everyone. Don't let the next headline be the last word. Insist on process, demand documented facts, and expect institutions to do the hard work of investigation and the hard work of explaining what that work actually involves. Only then will the public know that neither tragedy was simply a moment of noise but rather the subject of rigorous, transparent inquiry that honors victims and serves the cause of truth.